Hey, Jolo. I'm an English lad who used to be well into camping when I was a teen. Me and some buds used to go onto the moors whenever we got the chance, and we just pile into Chegger's car on a Friday night and F off into the middle of nowhere with some tents and some bevies, some disposable barbecues, and more meat than we knew what to do with. We got into camping and orienteering when we did the Duke of Edinburgh stuff in school, which is basically a series of challenges relating to wilderness survival and community stuff. One of our mates, Milo, had gotten so into it that he'd effed off to join the army, but the rest of us just kept the tradition up during holidays from uni. We weren't all sporty guys or anything like that. Well, some of us weren't. Powell was, and he was a proper mad rugby lad doing a sports science degree. But then there was Cheggers, who was teased for being a proper nerd because he'd studied engineering, even though he was the one with a decent car and the de facto leader of the group. And then there was Brody, Sammy, and me studying physics, English lit, and drama respectively. Yeah, I'm a theater kid, I'll admit it. I was a bit of a rowdy twat back then too, though, so were all of us. We were well aware of it, and we wanted to be seen as polite, sensitive boys. That's why we like to go out in the absolute middle of nowhere, and all the mud and cow crap and English pea super mornings, and just let loose. That's what we always did. It's what we got up to on our first night that summer, and what we planned to do for the next 6 nights when we were all back in town for our second-year summer break. So imagine our surprise when we all woke up with stinking hangovers that one Saturday morning, rolled out of our respective tents, and were faced with an old hippie-looking couple pitching their tent in the adjacent clearing to ours. We'd found this isolated forest a year ago and had come here a few times since. We made a semi-permanent fire pit out of bricks, and there had never been any indication that anyone else had used it besides us. Quickly sobering up and warning Powell to behave nicely, we strolled over to the older couple to introduce ourselves and ask if they wanted any help setting up. Most of us were pretentious little scroats back then and considered ourselves very world-wise and cultured, so we quite liked the idea of camping next to an old hippie couple who probably had good stories to tell and hopefully some weed if we were lucky. You could smell that they smoked, though. The lady looked to be in her 60s. She was thin, gaunt really, with frizzy hair and a kind of manic smile. She had these huge, thick glasses that made her eyes look almost comical, and I immediately found her adorable. The guy was big, built like a brick outhouse, and he had the biggest, bushiest beard I'd ever seen in my life. He wore that old green army jacket that every young guy in the UK seemed to own in the 2000s, but he was much older, and the jacket didn't fit him well. He also wore this fascinating weird hat that was covered in badges, pins, fishing flies, all manner of stuff really, and it was like a punk school backpack but on his head, and it was the hat that first jogged my memory. "Hey, are you Mr. Hamrodden?" I blurted out after some small talk. "Used to be an art teacher." He said he was. He smoothed the beard down and I could see it. When he taught me art in secondary school, he'd been completely clean-shaven. He'd been my favorite art teacher in years 7, 8, 9, and 10, but then he'd left the school halfway through my GCSE years and I never knew why. It kinda sucked because the new art teacher we got after him was a battle axe who had very strong, strict opinions about what art had to be, and I was glad to ditch her for my A-level art course. Cheggers and Sammy had been in my art class in years 7 to 9 as well, so they were made up to recognize Mr. Hanrodden. Not his actual name, by the way, just very similar. You can probably guess it, but I don't want to get sued. Now, Brody vaguely remembered him too, even though he'd never had classes with Hanrodden. I looked around for Powell, but saw that he went off into the woods and was disappearing among the trees. Hanrodden introduced the woman that he was with as his partner, Sainsbury's. This is actually what she called herself, like the supermarket. No idea if it was her real name. They had some Sainsbury's bags with them, so I always figured that they'd just taken the name from that. I just didn't see how it could matter at the time, and I thought they were trying to be funny. You don't really suspect that old people were up to no good, especially old beloved teachers. Utterly dumb, I guess, but hey, I'll happily admit to being an idiot when I was a teen in the 2000s. We helped Hamradin and Sainsbury set up their tent. They told us that they'd parked in the same car park that we were in and that they'd seen Chegger's car. We asked them how they knew about our little hidden forest spot and whether they had been here before. They said they had, many times, and had made use of our fire pit, which they were grateful for. Like I said, we'd never seen any indication that anyone had used it, but it's not like we went over it with Batman Arkham Asylum detective vision. We shared some lunch with a couple, then went our separate ways to go on a hike. Powell was nowhere to be seen, which wasn't super unusual. He'd sometimes go off hiking by himself. And looking at it now, I think Powell is neurodivergent in some way, because he needs these periods of alone time every now and then, and when we were kids, he'd often just disappear without telling anyone. Needless to say, we don't think anything of it when we didn't see Powell all afternoon. He wasn't back at the tent when we returned from the hike either, but Hanrodden and Sainsbury were, and we ended up hanging out with them all night, listening to music on Brody's battery-powered stereo, drinking some beers, and then frying up some steaks on the camp stove. Hanrodden regaled us all with stories about his time as a teacher, his time as a hippie in the swinging 60s, and his time in the army of all things, and then his recent life as a touring camper with his girlfriend. Sainsbury kept relatively quiet, chipping in every now and then about her vegan lifestyle, joking about the meat we were eating and stuff, although not in a judgy, unpleasant way. Hanrodden chowed down on some steak, and I noticed that they didn't contribute any food or drink all night, but I still had hope that they'd share the weed that I knew they had. And as the sun was setting, Hanrodden brought out a selection of baggies from his pocket. Brody and Sam had passed out drunk by this point and crawled into their tents. Powell still wasn't back, and I was beginning to get a little concerned. Chegger said it was fine, though. He even had a mobile phone reception, so he managed to fire off a few texts to Powell. And there was nothing to do but wait, so I turned my attention back to my old art teacher. I'd expected him to have some weed, and he did, but there was more than that. A strip of what looked to be LSD tabs, a bag of pills, and a huge bag of mushrooms. Hanrodden claimed that they'd picked the mushrooms that afternoon on their hike, but that obviously wasn't true. They'd been meticulously dried out and packaged, and I knew from experience that drying out magic mushrooms of any kind takes ages. Cheggers was down for a joint, but he really had to persuade Hanrodden to share. It was like they didn't want to waste anything on him. On the other hand, both Hanrodden and Sainsbury were really keen to get me to drop a tab of acid. When I absolutely point-blank refused, they offered me a pill. I'd always imagined pills to be the go-to drug for ravers and 20-somethings on lads' holidays, not aging hippies in their 60s. Probably prejudice, but hey. Either way, I wasn't buying what they were selling, no matter how much they insisted it was free, no strings attached. I smoked part of a joint, just so I could let Cheggers have some, then they started to go on about mushroom tea. I didn't really have any say in the matter, I guess. They were already boiling up the water in our kettle over our camp stove, and chucked a whole handful of the mushrooms in. I asked if they were sure the shrooms were safe, and I remember even though the haze of a pot and beer, I felt a very sobering chill when Hanrodden waved my question away and vaguely said, "I guess so." After they brewed the tea, Chegger snatched up a cup before the couple could protest and downed it. I didn't think he'd ever done shrooms before, so I was a little worried. And sure enough, he very quickly stood up and began to wander around the woods. I get a nagging panic in the back of my mind that I needed to take care of my friends. Cheggers was stumbling around hallucinating gnomes, and Sammy and Brody were passed out, and Powell was God knows where. Unfortunately, I was forced to primarily focus on myself. Hanrodden and Sainsbury were trying to force a huge mug of mushroom tea onto me in between more attempts to get me to drop a tab. It was all getting a bit much for me, and I felt the fear build up in my chest. I was pretty stoned and regretting my decisions immensely. The cold chill of paranoia gripped the back of my head, and I started puking into a pile of leaves. Sainsbury came over to me and put her thin arm around my shoulder. She led me back to the campfire and Hanrodden held up a cup to my lips and tried to feed me that mushroom tea. I pretended to drink, closing my mouth to the lid, then smacking my lips like it was the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted. Puking had caused me to start sobering up. Cheggers was frolicking through the trees, trying to catch a gnome or a fairy or some such thing that he was yelling about. My vision was blurred and confused, and panic was starting to grip me. I felt Sainsbury rubbing my shoulders, and then Mr. Hanrodden doing the same. He was talking about a commune in the 60s or something, free love and nudism. He asked me if I wanted to take my clothes off, and I said no. And both their hands were all over me, prodding and poking and groping. They tried to put a pill in my mouth and I spat it out, shouting at them. Nearby, Cheggers let out some whoop of joy and then collapsed into a heap on the forest floor. And to this day, I have no idea how much of what I saw was panic and how much was a skunk-induced hallucination. The weed I'd smoke had to be laced with something. There's no way that the residue of the mushroom tea against my lips would have caused any hallucinations, I don't think. Hanrodden took on the appearance of the devil, a demonic face glaring from his huge beard. Sainsbury was a crowing harpy, and the forest around us was filled with laughing, shadowy figures, and Hanrodden was telling me that everything would be better if I just gave in and took my clothes off with him. Then he started doing things to himself. Even as a 19-year-old, it made me sick to see an adult old man doing that toward me, and I began to scramble away, blinking frantically to clear my mind of the fog and confusion they'd forced on me with the drugs and booze. And then I heard it, a visceral, furious bellow from the forest. For a moment I thought it was Bigfoot, or a werewolf, or a mountain man, and then my mind cleared, and I saw my mate Pal charging through the trees, swinging a great big stick as he ran. He hooted at Hanrodden, telling him to get off me and leave me alone. Then he swung the huge branch he held and crushed Hanrodden's tent in one smash. That guy was scrambling away from Pal, dragging Sainsbury with him. Pal ran to me and held a can of Coke to my lips. He had me drink and then slapped my cheeks gently. The sugar and the shock helped me sober up a bit more, and I joined Pal in screaming at that old art teacher, who was struggling to pull up his pants as he scrambled along the forest floor. Pal advanced on the elderly couple, swinging his tree branch, and I watched them exchange words. Pal grabbed Hanrodden by the collar and shook him, shouting and spitting into the old man's face. I could vaguely understand why, but everything still seemed like a chaotic nightmare. My head was spinning, my heart was pounding, and I watched as Pal escorted Hanrodden and Sainsbury into the trees and away. And slowly, I passed out. I woke up in the tent as the sun was rising, and crawling out I came face to face with two very hungover friends, Sammy and Brody. Pal was there too, fresh-faced and rested. He hadn't taken anything the night before, so for once in our lives, Pal was actually the designated sober guy. And he explained that he had chased off those weirdos and made sure that they'd gotten into their car and left. At first I freaked out, forgetting the events of the night and thinking Pal had forced them to drive drunk and stoned. But then things came back to me. It also struck me that not once had I actually seen Hanrodden himself smoke or drink, and it seemed like he'd just been intent on me getting absolutely messed up. Eventually, Cheggers got up too, and after being sick as a dog in the woods, we all had some coffee and a long chat. And Pal told us everything. After we recognized that art teacher, he'd stalked off because years ago, in year 7, he had a horrific experience with the teacher and never told anyone. It wasn't as bad as it could have been, Pal said, and he wouldn't give us any real details, but here's what happened. Pal had been a slow developer and had special classes in years 7 and 8 for kids who were behind. For some reason, this involved a weekend trip to a farm, and Hanrodden was one of the other teachers chaperoning it. According to Pal, that guy had walked in on him in the showers every single night on the trip and continued to make creepy remarks to him after they'd returned to school. Pal said that he didn't think it was enough to tell anyone about it, which we sort of chastised him for that, but when he realized that the old guy we met was Hanrodden, He saw red and had to go for a hike to cool off. He also said that he couldn't prove this, but he'd heard that that guy had left our school when he did because there had been some other accusations aimed at him regarding his behavior towards some of the kids. I have since looked into this and verified that this is in fact likely true, although nothing was ever proven in court. I'd love to name and shame this guy. He's still alive even today from what I can gather, albeit an ancient man. And I hope he suffers crippling arthritis every day. What a creep. I never could actually uncover who Sainsbury was or what her story was, and I was a little miffed at Powell for leaving us with a guy he suspected of being dangerous. But we were all grown adults, even if only just, and Powell was the only one who eventually came and saved us all after all. But yeah, that's the story of how my former art teacher drugged and groomed me. Kind of put a damper on the camping trips, and I can't help but wish that Powell had cracked that dirty old man a proper one with his tree branch. It's truly what he deserved. So in the early 2010s, my buddy and I, my buddy being Sean, used to go camping in the Sierra Nevada. We'd usually pitch up a tent somewhere near Mount Whitney or go hiking around Lake Tahoe, but we went all over the area. We were both native Californians, and our beloved mountain range was our absolute favorite place to spend time when we needed a break from the rat race. One time, we settled on a spot we'd never explored before. It was a fairly remote site off the beaten track, and we couldn't find any evidence that it had ever been camped at. Exactly the kind of spot Sean and I'd like to check out and document. I was a bit of a journaling nerd, and at the time I think I was using LiveJournal or Tumblr to post sincere, intensely purple travel and nature writing. Now, I wish I still had an archive of most of it. It was incredibly abominable, but I had so much fun doing it, and that's the main thing. Sean was more of a photographer, and he still is, and basically spent most of our trips with a camera glued to his eye. Never ever suggest to that man that he use a cell phone for photography, though. You'll get a rant about how it's sacrilegious to use a camera thinner than a DVD case. Me, I'm happy to snap pics with my Samsung. And back then I wrote everything down in notebooks, and Sean would capture it on his Nikon or whatever expensive piece of equipment he was using at the time. He'd been entering some online photography competitions, which is why he was stoked when he found this pristine camping spot that none of the Sierra Nevada forums we'd frequented had ever mentioned. We set up a tent and spent the night beside a bunch of trees, and we cooked up some burgers on our little stove there and then settled in for the night. And everything passed without incident, and we awoke refreshed the next day, ready to explore the area. The area where we camped was segmented by a small river. We followed the water upstream through the outcrops to the base of a small mountain. Sean paused to photograph what he insisted was a golden eagle flying overhead, and a bit later we spied a mountain lion prowling across some rocks, thankfully in the far distance on a different mountain. Now eventually we broke for lunch in the shade of a cliff face. I scrawled some notes in my journal while Sean snapped some more pics, and he disappeared behind some rocks, and then I heard him calling to me pretty excitedly. Now stopping my writing, I headed over. Sean had found a cave. Something about the gaping dark opening in the rock gave me the creeps though, and I suggested that maybe we should move on. The area is home to some black bears and various other things like mountain lions obviously, and this could have easily have been their lair. Sean said that he wanted to get a few photographs of the cavern entrance, and we were both armed and had bear spray and all that good stuff, so it didn't seem too risky. We stepped into the opening and almost immediately we were swallowed by the darkness. It was eerie. It felt like we'd stepped into liquid shadows. Behind us, the sun beat down, but inside the cave, it was pitch black. I snapped my flashlight on, warning Sean not to take any flash photography just in case it startled anything that might be lurking in the cave. The cavern seemed to descend deep into the rock. I stepped forward, curiosity getting the better of me, and something crunched under my foot. I looked down, It was some kind of bone, the leg of a deer or cow or something. I felt Sean's hand grab my arm, and he whispered something and nudged my flashlight upward. There was movement deep in the cave, and I tensed, trying to decide if I should reach for my gun when Sean spoke again. "It's a person," he said. A shadow darted across the beam of the flashlight. It did look like someone was up ahead. A humanoid shadow flashed across the wall for a split second, and I was sure that I saw some pale flesh in the beam. I called out.
"Hello?"
My voice echoed through the dark cave. Sean was whispering that we should hightail it out of there, and I knew he was right, but the explorer in me was winning out. I was curious. There are all sorts of rumors about mountain folk living in the Sierra Nevada. My uncle used to tell one story about a family that he'd known that were so poor that they lost their house to the bank and had to go live in a cave. He told it to me as a cautionary tale, a reason to be thankful for what I had, but I'd always found something romantic and fascinating about the idea of impoverished folk living in a cave in the mountains. I dreamed of it as a kid, and now there was a chance that I could meet someone who actually lived here. It was fascinating. Then Sean brought me crashing back to Earth with, "Dude, don't be a moron," and began dragging me forcefully by the arm out of the hole in the rock. I called out one last time.
"Hello?" "Get!"
Echoed back.
"Get gone!"
Then a string of curse words I won't force you to read for your YouTube monetization reasons. It certainly didn't sound like some feral mountain man. In fact, it sounded very much like the junkies I'd seen panhandling on the Strip or on any low-income street you'd care to walk down. And at that moment, my illusion was shattered. We ran out of the cave, tails between our legs, and decided that was enough exploration for one day. Time to head back to our tent. And by the time we did, it was mid-afternoon, and I was looking forward to kicking back and getting some writing done. Nothing doing, though, because when we reached the tent, we were met with a completely terrifying sight. Our tent was covered in blood. At least that's how it looked at first in our momentary freak-out panic. We've been talking about mountain men and cave-dwelling junkies for the entire walk back, so I'm not surprised that we jumped to conclusions. But when your tent is covered in red liquid, what do you assume? Now, up close, it was much clearer that it was some type of paint. Someone had tossed a can of red paint all over the outside of our tent. Thankfully, we hadn't left anything important behind, but the tent itself was clearly ruined. More paint had been splashed into the interior, soiling the sleeping bags too, and there was even the word "leave" having been written in paint across the canvas. And at that moment, of course, we did. It was a couple of hours' hike to the car, and we had no shelter and nowhere to sleep, so there was nothing to do but drive to the nearest town and get a motel for the night. We hung out in a bar just down from the motel and got talking to the bartender. We told him about our close encounter with that feral mountain man, and he just laughed. Apparently that area was home to a gang of meth cooks, and their junkie clients would often camp out or hang around the mountainside. He said it was surprising we only bumped into one of them. There's normally a few trailers dotted around that area, meth heads letting off guns and all sorts of stuff. I still don't know to this day if he was actually screwing with us, but he seemed amused and surprised that we'd escaped that encounter intact. According to him, there was a shooting around there almost every week. Sean and I decided not to go camping off that beaten path after that. We still went exploring for many years after, but we stuck to places that weren't home to murderous meth addicts or feral cave dwellers. About 6 years ago now, I was dating a girl who I'll just call Julia. I'd been with her for about 8 months when the story took place. We had, so I thought, a pretty normal, happy, healthy relationship. We did all the things a young couple does. We lived and worked in the same town, we met on OkCupid, and we had a few dates and then got serious. After 8 months, we hadn't moved in together, although I'd been thinking of asking her. Julia always talked about how she liked her independence, though, and I didn't want to make the mistake I'd made in my last relationship of coming on too strong or moving too fast. Instead of living together, we would take regular vacations together. They were usually long weekend getaways, either to visit my folks or shopping trips. One time, we did a tour of a few theme parks over the course of some weekends, and it was great, and we became the couple that vacationed together. I thought everything was going perfectly. Like I said, I was thinking of asking her to move in, and maybe down the line popping the question. To my knowledge, our relationship was solid as a mountain. And I'm sure that since I'm saying all of this, you've already worked out that it wasn't. Instead, it became a source of crushing fear for me in a way that I could have never have predicted. We'd never been camping before. We didn't want to have to spend too long on the road, so the nearby state of Rhode Island seemed like a perfect destination. It has a number of fantastic campgrounds, and we picked the one that looked the most appealing. Something not too isolated, but not too busy either, and fairly near the coast where we plan to spend the second half of our 2-week vacation in an Airbnb. It was early fall, and Rhode Island is stunning at that time of the year. The drive down took maybe 8 hours, including a couple of stops, and as we passed into the forested countryside in the heart of New England, Julia couldn't stop talking about the natural beauty around us. And in that moment, my heart swelled with love and excitement at spending 2 weeks in beautiful Charleston with Julia. The campsite was beautiful. We picked a quiet time to come, so there weren't that many other campers around, and our spot was gloriously isolated, tucked away on the very outskirts of the camping area with a forest right next to our site, and a beautiful little pond twinkling in the afternoon sun just a short distance away. I think I remember using the words idyllic to Julia in a very breathless voice. It was pretty cringe looking back, not because I was wowed by nature, but, well, you'll see. The first night went by fast and wonderfully. We cooked up some wieners over the campfire, spent some quality time in the tent, and then went for a late-night hike through the forest and grounds, ending beside the pond where we sat and took in the moonlight off the water. And I just sat with my arm around my girlfriend, and I genuinely thought that life was perfect. The next morning, I realized that I couldn't have been more wrong. I woke up to the sound of Julia yelling. Even at the time, I remember getting this weird feeling about it, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I scrambled to pull some clothes on and then dashed out into the clearing. Our stuff was trashed, and it looked like this rampaging group of hogs had just come crashing through the campsite, although there was no way that could be the case. I wasn't the heaviest sleeper, and I hadn't woken up until Julia screamed. And I looked around in dismay. Our cooler of food, which we'd left sealed in the car, was completely smashed everywhere. There are only a small number of black bears in Rhode Island, and none remotely close to this family commercial campsite. Burgers, sausages, mac and cheese, and all sorts of stuff lay scattered about the camp, like some kind of high school food fight gone wrong. A case of beers had been punctured and thrown around the grounds, and the whole place just stank of that old yeasty alcohol. And then it struck me that if the cooler from the car was smashed, that meant... And then I turned up to look. And of course, the back windshield of the car was smashed, and that's seemingly how they'd gotten the cooler out. Not only that, my beautiful new BMW had these terrible gouges and scratches in the paintwork on one side, and I literally almost wept when I saw that. Honestly, that car was my baby. Julia was yelling frantically. She told me they'd smashed our phones and gestured to a pile of shattered glass and electronics at the base of a large tree. And she was right. Both my phone and hers were completely destroyed. Something about this piqued my curiosity, though, but I was too shocked and dismayed at the whole scenario to really think much about it. There was just this nagging, unpleasant feeling about the phones. Finally, Julia pointed to the forest nearby where some of her clothes, which had been in a case in the car, were thrown over the bushes. In particular, a few of her underwear were on prominent display. Julia immediately and forcefully began telling me her theory about what had happened. A group of guys, probably frat bros, had come rampaging through our camp at night, drunk out of their minds. They'd decided to screw with us and terrify us, and Julia had, she insisted, seen the group of frat bros camping on the other side of the campsite when we'd first arrived the day before. I asked if she'd actually seen them invade our camp, and she was very cagey about this, said that she thought so, but it was dark and she couldn't be sure. I let it drop for now and then began cleaning up the campsite. Julia helped. As we tossed the food and retrieved her clothes, I said that it was a bummer our camping trip had been cut short, and Julia shocked me then by looking horrified, grabbing my hands, and begging if we could stay. I questioned this. Why on earth would we stay when our things had just been trashed, the car had been vandalized, and worse, these people could still be at the campsite? Now, we called the cops, of course, and a ranger came to see us a few hours later. He said there really wasn't much that could be done, apparently, which seemed like bullcrap to me, and he promised to ask around the camp anyway and told us to keep an eye out to be safe. I asked him if he thought we should move along, and he was pretty dismissive that it was just kids. Kids who'd cost me a bunch of food bills and vehicle repairs and phone repairs. And after the ranger left, Julia pointed out that there was a store on the other side of the campgrounds, that we could just buy a tarp for that back windshield, and that it could be fixed on the second part of our vacation on the coast. There was no sense in canceling everything on day 2 just because of some chaos like this. Now, in the moment, I told her that was okay, we'd see how it went. I was distracted, still kind of seething with fury over what had been done to my car, and also trying to pin down the nagging concern I had in the back of my mind, as all of this, for as insane as it was, obviously didn't feel right. And later that day, after a lot of affection from Julia, I started to calm down. We went for a walk to the camp store to recoup some supplies. I didn't tell Julia, but I was also keeping an eye out for vandal frat boys that she alleged to have invaded our camp. I couldn't really see any group of guys that really matched that description by Julia, and I couldn't decide whether this was a relief or kind of strange. I did see the ranger chatting to a few folks, though, and he sent me a little wave, as if to say, "Yep, I'm doing my job," so I guess that made me feel safe. Now, when we were in the camp store, Julia and I got into the dumbest argument. I don't even remember what it was about, but I do remember it surprised me how much she lost her crap. I think I jokingly disagreed with her about what kind of wieners to get, and she just flipped, yelling at me that I never listened to her or took her opinions into consideration. And this was the first time I'd ever heard about this, and I guess I got defensive. Not an excuse, but I was still mad and upset about the car, and also a little frustrated at Julia for wanting to stay at the campground where we'd been the victims of an actual crime. And Julia stormed off, leaving me to finish up the groceries and pay the bill. I did so, and then I wandered outside to look for her. There was no sign of my girlfriend, but I did see a small group of guys who could possibly maybe be the frat bros if you squinted. And they seemed like chill, nice guys, but I approached them anyway and asked if they'd seen any other suspicious characters around their age camping in the park. They told me they'd been there for a few days already and hadn't seen anyone under the age of 40 other than myself and Julia. And that checked out for my observations too. Then, one of them came up to me and quietly asked if I was okay. I figured the stress of the day must have been in my face or something, so I explained that our car and campsite had been vandalized. This seemed to shock the kid, so I asked him why he'd checked in with me. He told me the woman I was with seemed, and he paused here, saying, volatile and angry. I figured he must have seen Julia stomping away after our argument, but it all seemed pretty strange. When I got back to the campsite, everything was incredibly quiet except for this faint sobbing coming from our tent. I dropped the groceries on the picnic table and ran over there. Julia was sitting in the tent, and tears were streaming down her eyes, rocking back and forth. I went to her and put my arm around her. Eventually, I got her to calm down, and she told me what had happened. She returned to our tent after our argument, and 3 guys had showed up. She said they threatened her and made some lewd advances toward her, and then when she rejected them, one of them had kicked a dent in the door of the car. I wanted to go out and check as soon as I knew Julia was unharmed. But consoling Julia was more important, and I started asking her questions about the guys so we could tell the cops. What did they look like? What race were they, etc.? And Julia started yelling at me, saying I was inconsiderate and thoughtless. I hadn't even asked her if she wanted to get the cops involved, and she didn't actually. She wanted to just drop it, and how dare I grill her about the details. Then she started asking me if I thought she was a liar, etc. Now I'm completely shocked and taken aback. I hadn't been entertaining thoughts like that at all. I had wanted to know so we could identify them, obviously, and now that Julia had freaked out so badly, though, again, a suspicion began nagging at me. It did seem like Julia was hiding something. What if they'd assaulted her worse than she'd let on? And that's where my mind went first. But man, was I naive. That night, I was adamant I wanted to leave. There sure was a dent in my car door, and the whole vacation had been completely tainted and overshadowed by this stupid series of terrible assaults. And Julia was over-the-top enthusiastic, though. And she went absolutely out of her way to try insisting that we were having a great time, that it didn't matter if we were being targeted by harassers, that we'd be just letting them win if we gave in and rolled over. And honestly, I said I was happy to let them win if it meant safety and a harassment-free weekend, and this made Julia mad again. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of the attacks, but as we sat in silence around the campfire, both of us were just kind of sulking after yet another argument, I realized what had been bothering me the whole time. Without even thinking, I brought it up to Julia. How had the vandals smashed our phones when we'd gone to sleep with our phones in the tent the night before? They hadn't been charging in the car. We'd both fallen asleep watching YouTube and some reels, and Julia opened her mouth, closed it again, opened it, and then closed it. She stared at me, and if looks could kill, I swear I'd be a dead man. Then she began to scream at me. She asked me where I got off accusing her and what I was trying to imply. I hadn't accused her of anything. I just asked how the vandals got a hold of our cells when they were in the tent. I hadn't mentioned her at all. And at this point, the red flags were impossible to ignore, and it was obvious that Julia was involved somehow. I'm sure it's been obvious to everyone that Julia was behind the vandalism, and you probably think I'm an idiot for not suspecting her right away. In my defense, it's easier to make it look that way when I'm telling the story in retrospect, and I'm not some professional storyteller or master of tension, so I've probably given away the fact that Julia was the culprit right at the start. But sure enough, that's the conclusion I started suspecting at this point. And as gently as I could, since she was behaving so volatile and erratic, I asked my loving girlfriend if there was anything she wanted to tell me, and if she knew something about the vandalism. That's when she broke down and confessed everything. She was convinced that I no longer loved her. I was going to break up with her on this vacation, and I'd been planning to for months. She thought I was cheating on her. She thought I cared more about my new car than her, and I guess that's why she did so much damage to the car in particular. Now please let me stress that there was absolutely no truth to any of these claims. Even in the aftermath, a few of our friends decided to believe Julia and low-key suspected me of having done something to trigger her behavior. And I can swear to the Lord above that I didn't. I did not so much as look at another woman in that way, and I genuinely thought Julia was the one. And that night, around the campfire, she told me that she thought that I would start to love her again if I thought we were in danger, that my male protector instincts would kick in and I'd go back to caring about her like I used to. I was speechless, furious at first and then sort of just sad. The love of my life was clearly having some kind of mental breakdown, and I had no idea what to do about it. The first thing I did was pack up the car. No way were we staying on a vacation under this cloud, and Julia begged me to stay one more night and check us into a hotel, but I couldn't. We began the drive home that same evening, and let me tell you, that was the most awkward, silent road trip of my entire life. My plan was to get Julia home and then work out the next steps, maybe get her medical help or therapy. I didn't expect this to be the end of our relationship, but yeah. I have no idea what happened to Julia, and I wish I could have helped her. I took her back to her apartment in the early hours of the morning and told her we'd talk the next day. I woke up to find that she'd blocked me on everything: social media, Facebook, email, my phone number, and then I started getting messages from friends asking why I treated her so poorly. And things escalated from there, and I eventually had no choice but to just make a clean break. I cut Julia out of my life. I cut most of our mutual friends out, and eventually I moved away to a completely different state. Nearly a decade later, I still occasionally get threatening messages from random accounts calling me a cheater, a rat. One time in a city far from anywhere I'd ever been with Julia, my car got vandalized again, and it was probably a completely coincidental piece of bad luck, but it's hard not to be paranoid. I have no idea if Julia ever got help or got better, and it breaks my heart to think about it. I'm married now to a beautiful woman who is pregnant with my child, and I managed to suppress that paranoia. I spent a lot of our early relationship convinced that she was going to suddenly turn on me. It hasn't happened yet, and maybe I was an oblivious idiot though, but I never saw any signs of it with Julia either. Everything was perfect, and then our first camping trip seemingly broke her. Maybe I'm just superstitious, but anytime my current wife brings up the idea of camping, all I can say is absolutely not. When I was a much younger guy, I did a lot of stupid things to try to impress a girl, most of which I don't really want to get into right now, but maybe the most reckless one that I'm willing to admit to was I agreed to protest a fracking development in a small village in Sussex. I didn't know what I was getting myself into when Amy, the girl that I was into, took me to buy camping gear. I thought we were just going to make some noise and wave some placards, not spend the night there. She was telling me about how important this was, and I tried to look like I understand. The next morning, about 100 of us pitched our tents by the side of the road, ready to block any traffic into the drilling site. Someone had rigged up a PA and was playing Black Sabbath, and every time a car passed through the road, we ran out to block it and chanted our slogans. As one passed, I tried to get enough signal on my phone to text my mom that I wouldn't be back that night. Later in the day, when everyone had eaten all the snacks they brought, one legend had brought a whole barbecue and enough burgers and sausages to share, almost evenly cooked, and we all went back to our tents. We got there a bit too late to get the best spots, so ended up a bit further back than the rest of them, but I didn't think that would matter. As we both got to our tents, in the camping shop I jokingly suggested it would be cheaper to get one big one, or at least after she said no, I said it was a joke. Amy pulled out a cooler and offered me a cider. I'd hoped I'd done enough to make her think I was boyfriend material. I'd even shown her how to put the guy ropes in, which she'd had to move. We were woken up a few hours later by the owner of the tiniest edge of land we'd inadvertently been camping on. In my sleepy state, I couldn't make out a word he was saying, but the moonlight made clear enough the shotgun he was waving at us. He looked very angry, and I assumed he was saying something along the lines of "get off my land." We had just about enough time to run out of our tents before he could shoot at us. The farmer began screaming and hollering, and I have honestly never been more afraid. I only had my underwear on, and luckily Amy had been sleeping in a Spider-Man t-shirt, which, in different circumstances, well, looking back, I'd have just grilled her about comic book trivia, so I'd only have embarrassed myself. In our panic, we didn't run towards other camping protesters and safety, or at least numbers, but in the other direction. The road we'd been protesting on was between two villages, and I knew that there was no chance we'd make it to the next one before the farmer caught up with us. In this darkness, we could easily get lost if we went off the road, but so could he, so this seemed like the best option. I tried to get Amy's attention, and then grabbed her hand and ran into the woods, hoping she'd run with me, which she did. It was at this point I regretted having seen the Blair Witch Project recently. The woods quickly became dense enough that we had to give up holding hands, so I had no idea how far away she was. I hoped that she was still near me, but in the almost total darkness, I could barely see her or anything. A few times I nearly ran into a massive oak tree. It might have been the same one. And once I tripped on a root, feeling my knees smash into the earth before I could reflexively put my hands out to brace myself. I must have lost Amy a while ago, but I couldn't even be sure when. I was also very lost myself and not sure how far I'd be able to run now. I considered just lying there to wait in the cold and dark for the morning light to come, and then I heard a cry. It was Amy. Imagining the farmer with a shotgun and the trouble Amy could be in, I ran towards where I thought I'd heard the sound. I think I must have hurt myself a few more times in tree branches or something, because the next morning I had a lot more cuts and bruises. I managed to catch up with Amy, but so had the farmer. I suppose as a gesture of politeness, he wasn't pointing his shotgun directly at me, which I assumed he probably would if it was me he'd found. But it was still a threat. He hadn't noticed me yet, but I didn't really want to hurt him when, out of the three of us, he'd probably had the best idea of how to find the road. I pleaded with him that we hadn't meant to use his land, that we wouldn't do it again, that we were lost, and that it had been my idea to join the protest, so he should at least let Amy go. I don't know what he'd been planning to do or what he would do. I just hoped that by taking the blame it might wrong-foot him enough to not hurt us. I guess he must have been a bit lost himself, because after a few seconds, he started laughing. And I later found out from his wife that the shotgun wasn't even loaded and was too rusty to fire. Luckily, the protest camp was still noisy enough that without confusion of the chase, we could more or less just walk towards it. As we started to talk about why we'd been camping there, we even managed to bring him around a bit and offered to take some leaflets once Amy had gotten back to her feet, because obviously she didn't have any on her. I think at that point he noticed I'd lied about it being my idea to come, but with the tension gone and it being a noble lie anyway, he just laughed it off and offered us into the farmhouse for a cup of tea. I never did get a date with Amy, but we became very close friends, so I don't look back with too much shame on that night. I guess there's something about being at the other end of a very angry farmer holding a very real-looking shotgun which brings people together, even if it doesn't work well for romance. I never did return to the protest, and sometimes I wonder what happened with it. My name's Anton, and I'm from Germany, and please pardon if my English is not perfect. I learned to speak it from watching American TV and visiting America, and I taught myself. I'm an adventurer and hiker, and I spend much of my time camping and hiking all around Europe. Anywhere worth visiting, I've visited it, but the rest of the world had not been my playground yet. This is why for many years I harbored a dream of visiting finest Appalachia, the location of so many excellent scary stories and atmospheric adventures that I've seen. I'm a solo hiker, and I challenge myself to explore and survive in the wilderness alone. This has always been perfect for me, as I am a solitary individual, and throughout all of my travels in Europe, I have never encountered more than a few minorly troubling incidents. And this is why I, foolishly, embarked on a solo visit to the Appalachia Trail in the summer of 2014. I flew over to the States for my first visit and stayed with some friends that I had known for some years online. Then I rented a car and drove to the foot of the trail that I was going to hike. I had promised my friends that I'd follow the marked trail rigidly, as they were concerned about me doing this alone, but secretly I had decided to go where the wind took me. I did stick to the trail for the first day or two, but then I diverted. I have many years of experience as an explorer, so keeping track of my route was no problem for me. I headed into an area that appealed to me. The trees were so huge and towering, unlike anything we have in Europe, and I was taken by the beauty surrounding me. That night, I set up my tent beside a small pond. The beauty of the American countryside took my breath away, and I basked in the silence and tranquility of this new world. Back in Germany, it is stunning, but Appalachia, at least where I was very unique, and I was awestruck. That night, I drifted off watching the stars, and eventually I crawled inside my tent to sleep. I awoke later to sounds, howling and calling. At first I thought it might be a pack of wolves. I didn't have a firearm as a German person on vacation in the States, but I had a hunting knife, and it is this that I held as I was just frozen there in my tent, listening intently. The howling soon settled into human voices, and I couldn't understand their words at first, if they were saying words at all, but then they began to chant. If you leave, you'll die. If you leave, you'll die. I called out to them, as it was clear that they knew that I was inside the tent. Leave where? I asked. Leave the tent, they said. If you leave the tent, you will die. Will you kill me? I asked. No reply. A voice howled again, and then another said, if you leave, you'll die. And next I heard footsteps. It sounded like they were circling the tent. Fear gripped me, unlike anything I had ever felt before in my solo adventures. Was this to be the end of me, here in some foreign land? Was my life to be cut short by these Americans who I had for so long held in such high regard? I shifted in the tent and a voice called back, do not come out. I listened, and instead gripped my knife tighter, just as fear gripped me. More steps, then the sound of someone running, shouts and a commotion that seemed to have nothing to do with me. A voice outside the tent spoke and told me to stay put, and so I did. I had lit a fire in the pit that night, and now I saw the light from my fire flaring back up, lit by one of the strangers outside. Another jolt of panic. What if they burned me alive? But I could see the fire was not too close to the tent, even through the canvas. I held back a scream as I heard one gunshot, and then another. The voice outside the tent reaffirmed that I should stay put. I thought about challenging that voice, emerging with my knife and fighting for my life. But for what? They told me that I would be okay if I stayed inside, and so I did. 2 more gunshots, and then some more hooting and laughter. Whoever was out there, they were having some kind of fun, and I didn't know what violence was occurring, if any, and I did not know how serious the danger was directly to me. All I knew was that the men outside continued to tell me to stay in the tent where I was. At some point during that long, terrifying night, the fire was extinguished again, and this allowed me to relax somewhat, knowing that I would not be set ablaze by unseen hands while cowering inside my shelter. Somehow, eventually, tiredness caused me to pass out. When I awoke, I could see the sun had risen. For a moment, I forgot about the events of the night before, but I urgently needed to urinate and started to unzip the tent. Everything returned to my memory, and I froze, then called out. No reply. I waited, listened, gripped the knife, and opened the tent. I could see no signs of anything that occurred in the night, except for the fact that some of the undergrowth had been trampled down. Sitting by the fire, though, was a 6-pack of beer. It had not been there when I went to bed. I didn't drink it. I just left it where it was. 2 days later, I emerged from that Appalachian Trail area with my dream trip cut short. I've since hiked the Appalachian Trail again, but not alone, and within the safety of the trail markers. I have asked many people what they think I may have experienced that night. Nobody has any clear answers, and I don't either. I try to convince myself that I was the victim of a cruel prank, but it's hard to know for sure. They say strange things happen on the Appalachian Trail. Germany is the same, but not quite as much. Appalachia is beautiful and haunted and dangerous. I will go yet again someday, and as I do every time I visit that most remarkable of areas, I will pray that I don't encounter those men ever again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.